Hello, everybody, and welcome to Whitmix's webinar, How to Address an FDA 483 Warning Letter with Mr. John Waters. My name is Craig Pickett. I'm the Education Manager here for Whitmix Corporation, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. I'd like to begin with a few housekeeping items. And first of all, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you should see a questions box. Please feel free to type in any questions you have throughout the webinar, and John will be answering your questions at the end. Next, if you're a CDT, this webinar is approved for 1 hour of CE credit toward your certification in regulatory standards. You will receive an email within 1 to 2 days that'll tell you how to obtain that credit. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and within 48 hours it will be up on the Whitmix website in the webinar section, which is at the top of the page on our homepage. Now, by way of introduction, this morning I have the pleasure of introducing to you John Waters. John is the Regulatory Compliance Officer for Whitmix. John has worked in some regulatory capacity for most of his career. He has represented his employers at the local, state, and regional areas related to Environmental Protection Agency, Metropolitan Sewer District, Occupational Safety Health Administration, and the Food and Drug Administration. John has spent the last 7 years in medical device-related endeavors, and because of his firsthand FDA experience, he understands quality system regulations, or QSR, and he understands those from the agency's perspective. John's extensive experience with the FDA includes some of these areas: 21 CFR Part 820, device sterility and sterilization, 510K submissions, medical device reports, international FDA inspections, warning letter resolution, device classification and company classification, verification and validation, risk management, recalls, advisory notices, and market withdrawals. So you can see that John has quite an in-depth background. This webinar this morning is intended to address when and how to address FDA warning letters for device deficiencies. And with that, John, let's talk about those warning letters.
Thank you very much, Craig, for that glowing introduction. First of all, I would like to apologize to everyone that I'm from Southern Indiana, so as you can tell, I have a bit of a Southern accent. So if you have trouble understanding me, please feel free to, like Craig mentioned, to type in a question, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Again, my name is John Waters, and I've been in a QA capacity since 1997. I was general manufacturing from 1997 to 2005, and in 2005 is when I began my career into medical devices. Now, a lot of that experience was spent with the company that I had. They weren't educated to what the FDA requires. So along with that company, me and them and myself, we learned a lot, and we learned it fast. And I would just like to say that all the experience that I do have as far as resolving warning letters, FDA inspections, I'm happy to say that none of that has happened here at Whitmix. It was all with the previous company. So let's go ahead and get into the presentation. I hope that you all don't have to ever worry about how to address an FDA warning letter, but if you do, hopefully this will come in handy to be of some assistance to you. So again, my name is John Waters. I'm the Quality Assurance Manager here at Whitmix. I've been in FDA compliance since 2005. I do have 5 domestic and 1 overseas FDA inspections, and those are quite memorable. I won't go into the details here. If anyone would like to know the experiences and what to expect, you can email me or feel free to call, either one. I do have numerous ISO medical audits that I have either been the lead participant in or I have participated in just in general. And my experience comes from Class 1 and Class 2 medical devices. Class 3s are something that I have not had the experience yet to participate in. And Class 3s require, I won't say a skill level above mine, but it's experience that I have yet had to have. So what is the objectives of this webinar? Well, trying to think of this from someone like from the dental field, some people don't have that much exposure to FDA. So what I would hope to answer is, one, just how does one get a warning letter? You know, if do they all come from the FDA? Do they come from OSHA, or do they come from some other governmental agency? And you know, just how does one go about it, receiving one? Second one is learn what a warning letter is. There are some statements in there that if you are not accustomed to FDA, if you are not familiar with their terminology and lingo, it can be quite frightening. But there is no need for it to be if you're educated about a warning letter and what it is. Next, we want to learn how to remediate a warning letter. There is no, I'm going to say there's no form you can fill out. There's no tick box that you can do to say, well, I've done A, B, and C, so the warning letter remediation is fine. You need to educate yourself on warning letters, on what other people have done to address them, and how to go about it. And the last is waiting for the conclusion. I don't know, again, for those who don't have the experience, if you receive a warning letter and you send us your response into the government, they don't just automatically email you within a couple days and say, hey, we appreciate the response, everything's fine. There is quite a lengthy waiting period and a lot of red tape that has to come through the agency before that conclusion can happen. So, just how does one get a letter? Well, the FDA visits your facility, or sometimes a website, and they find objectionable methods, practices violation of the QSR. I would just like to say that there are many inspections that occur. And just because you have an inspection doesn't mean that you're going to get a warning letter. But that is an avenue how a warning letter can come about. There are official complaints. Either an employee or some other agency could say, file an official complaint with your organization to the FDA. And if that happens, the FDA is supposed to conduct an investigation, which is called a for cause. One thing you have to know about FDA is FDA plays a different game than OSHA. They play different than other governmental agencies. And not to detract from those others, but the FDA has the power to shut your company down. And no one wants to talk about that. And hopefully no one gets to that point. And you do have to have some very serious issues going on before they would even approach that. But they do have that ability if they needed to pull that out of their tool belt. And another way to get a warning letter that has become new within the last 2 or 3 years is websites. The FDA has an arm that actively looks at not just device company websites, but smoking, seafood, all the agencies that FDA has control over. They have a specific branch that looks at those websites. And if they find objectionable matter on the website, it could be a false, misleading statement, or sometimes what they call puffery, then they can issue a warning letter based specifically off they find on your website. But basically, if you want to know how one gets a letter, it's because there are violations of the quality system regulation. All those avenues that I mentioned, and one that I meant to mention as well, is if there are several complaints that the FDA has received from a medical device reporting standpoint. And MDR is for any time there's a death or serious injury associated with a company's device, that information is supposed to be submitted to the FDA. And when that happens, as it does quite often, the agency will take a look at those, and if they see a trend, if they see something that's arising where it looks like that there are more people or more situations in danger, they will give you a warning letter and sometimes conduct an inspection based off of that review as well. So some people don't know, what is a warning letter? Well, a warning letter usually begins with opening remarks, and it says something about what you have done. And the thing that catches most people's attention, it says your devices are adulterated. That's a scary. That's something scary to see in writing. If you are not knowledgeable about what this means, it looks like that your devices may be exempt from being sold at this moment, which isn't what the letter says at all. But again, this is just some of the remarks that come out of the warning letter. The warning letter also, it lists line item by line item the deficiencies that the agency encountered at your facility. There may be some deficiencies that are noted throughout the warning letter where it says, in this area, we found violation A. There is a violation in area B or area C, and so on and so forth. And the agency will list each and every one of those deficiencies, the deficiencies that they find. They will list it that you had to give a response to. So now lastly, let's look at some warning letters. Here's a warning letter. It was issued on August the 24th, 2018, and it's issued to Zimmer Biomet. Now, I just know that this information that you're seeing, it's not special, it's not controlled. Anyone can see it if one knows where to look for it. Again, it's addressed to Zimmer Biomet, and it says that the United States Food and Drug Administration conducted an inspection at Warsaw, Indiana, and during the inspection, FDA determined that your firm is a medical device manufacturer of orthopedic implants. So there it says that the FDA acknowledges what they were inspecting that you were a manufacturer of. And it says these products are devices. And again, FDA doesn't give a warning letter for anything but a medical device. And it's used in the conditions of the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or to affect the structure of any function of the body. And the underline is where people get a little excited or a little afraid. It says this inspection revealed that your devices are adulterated within the meaning of Section 501H, and that the methods used in or the facilities or controls used for their manufacture, packing, storage, or installation are not in conformity with the current good manufacturing practice requirements of the Quality System Regulation, or the QSR for short. Here's another example of a warning letter issued in July 25th, 2018. And as you can see, it's very similar. This particular manufacturer was Anigan. And it says during the inspection, an FDA investigator determined that your firm is a manufacturer of the Class 2, and I blotted out what it was there, the type cups. Again, if you look below, it says this inspection revealed that these devices are adulterated. So just to let you know that anytime a warning letter is issued, it always gives your pleasantries, what the FDA was in, and you were having an investigation for, what you're manufacturing, and then the devices are adulterated. Now, the last warning letter example is from a dental manufacturer. And just because, I'm not trying to make this manufacturer look bad or anything. So what I did was I blacked out all information that referred to exactly who the manufacturer was. But this was issued a while back in March 27, 2014. And it was to the Chief Operating Officer. You can tell that they're in California. And again, says they were the United States Food and Drug Administration determined that your firm manufactures dental implants and dental implant abutment systems. Now, while I realize that that's above and beyond what a lot of dental labs are engaged in, whether you are a manufacturer of a Class 1 or Class 2 medical device, you are subject to the FDA regulations. Now, what I'm going to take a look at for this particular warning letter, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I am going to look at the first item that they listed for this company. Okay, it says the finding number 1, failure to establish procedures for design changes as required by 21 CFR 820.30I. Now, having the experience that I do, if I were to receive this, the first thing that I would do is go to the CFR regulations from FDA. And as luck would have it, I happen to have a little handy dandy book right here in front of me. And section 820.30I says, each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures for the identification, documentation, validation, or where appropriate, verification, review, and approval of design changes before their implementation. And when it says that the failure to establish procedures in this warning letter, it's quite possible that the company had a procedure. But if they did, they weren't following it. And also, if they did, it wasn't sufficient to meet the FDA's expectations. If you go on through the letter, you can see that they were that they had screws being used with abutment blanks. And the inspection found that your firm substituted your own brand titanium screws to be used with the above referenced abutment blanks and implants, and did not validate these design changes prior to marketing the abutment system with your screws. And if you go on to the last part, it says your response is inadequate in that your firm promised corrections to validate all product platforms and systems referenced in the FDA 43, which have not yet been completed. Now, there's something I wanted to point out about this. The response is inadequate. If you do receive a warning letter from the FDA and they say that we'd like to have a response, you send that response in. Just because you send the response doesn't mean that you addressed it adequately. It doesn't mean that just because you send a response in, you get some favorable points for addressing those. The FDA expects compliance. And if they say that your response is inadequate, that means you have to do it again. Usually when that happens, you either need to get some expert advice in, or talk to a consultant, or talk to someone who has been in the game, if you will, of addressing warning letters. So now let's get into the meat of this. Okay, so how to remediate the letter? What should a company do? What steps should we take? What kind of committee should we form? Should we get together a task force? Well, unfortunately, this is the lot of response that some companies have. It's not a wise one. I have had, in my experience, I have had 1 or 2 people to call me for advice. And they say, hey, we got this letter and we were supposed to answer it like a month ago, but we never did. And we've not heard anything from them. Well, we'll talk about that. So first, a lot of people have this idea, if I ignore the warning letter, they will go away. Well, like I say, that is not a good option. Most letters say that you have to respond to the warning letter within 15 days of receipt. And if you wait past 15 days, okay, so you're not going to get a knock on the door. You're not going to get an email. You're not going to get a visit from the agency. None of those things will happen on day 16. But just let me say before I say that with full confidence that if you are a manufacturer of a Class 3 device, if you had some violations to where people were injured or perhaps people lost their life, heaven forbid, that does happen. If you wait too long, then yes, they will come to see why you have not addressed them or what is going on that they have not received a response. And lastly, if you choose to wait past your 15 days, then prepare for the consequences. The FDA have that within their power to come back on day 16. Again, likely won't happen. But when they do come back, they will expect an answer of why you didn't do it the first time. And usually on a second visit, they are not near as tolerant. They're not very amicable to work with. And that is something that you will have to unfortunately experience on your own and endure the pain that all the pain we can say that FDA can bear. So here's something that we need to do. You need to prepare for an education. And when I say prepare for an education, that doesn't mean that you need to go to university, although there are some classes that could greatly benefit you. But you're going to have to become immersed in the world of FDA, because FDA's rules and regulations, what they live in and breathe, the QSR, the quality system regulation. And that's all they understand. If they send someone to your facility for an inspection, that person may specialize in, they may be a mechanical engineer, or they could be a chemical engineer by trade, but they have come to work for the FDA. The thing about FDA is that any investigator can inspect any facility because they all use the QSR. So the best thing that one can do is get a copy of 21 CFR Part 820. There are numerous places on the web where you can either send in and you can get some of them for free. You can get them in a condensed version. You can get them right off the FDA's website because they are there in their entirety. And there are, again, there's numerous other places where one can obtain that information. Well, and when we're talking about this warning letter, first of all, don't guess what the letter means. I understand that some dental labs are very small facilities with not very many persons that can do business other than what you're there, day in and day out to do, which is make money. To address the warning letter, it really does take time and effort. But again, don't guess what that letter means. As I pointed out at the very beginning, when we were looking up 21 CFR 820.30, if that were in your warning letter, you would need to look into this regulation and see what that regulation means. Some of the regulations are, I won't say vague, but to a person that is not immersed in the regulations every day, it may become, it could be confusing. It could be unclear what the agency is asking for. But again, don't guess what the letter means. Once you get the letter, again, immerse yourself in the FDA. Learn and understand what the letter says. Attend webinars, like this one. Look at online training. There are numerous courses that people can attend. They aren't always in your location or in a time that's convenient to you. But again, if you're addressing a warning letter, you need to understand all that you can. And you need to know what the letter says specifically, because they will say, generally, hopefully, some good things as well as some unfavorable things. Next is learn and understand what the letter doesn't say. The letter does not say that you have been that you can't ship your product anymore. It doesn't say that we're going to come close your doors. The letter does not say those things. Okay. Now, it is very possible to receive a letter that does say those things. Fortunately, that doesn't happen to you. But if you do, you should probably get a consultant or someone to help you with that aspect of the letter. But again, learn and understand what the letter doesn't say. And you have 15 days. Now, to some people, that may not seem a lot of time. To some people, it may seem like an eternity. But you have those 15 days, so you don't have to rush, and you don't have to spend, you don't have to stay up for 24 hours a day for the next couple days compiling things that you are going to send to the FDA. It is not, if you don't know what the letter says, do not flood them with information. Sometimes that's necessary and it requires it. But don't just start sending them a bunch of information and a bunch of documentation if you don't know what the letter says and what you're sending them. And as far as this goes, use all the days. So again, back to the point that you don't have to address all these things in a couple, 3 days. If you need to bring someone in to help you, then bring those people in. It is possible that if you have someone coming in to help you, you can actually put that in your response to the warning letter that says we have someone coming in, a consultant or someone coming in that is going to help us address this, and we will have a letter to you with no more than 17 days, 18 days. That is not advisable. While some people have done it, it is not advisable. When the FDA says 15 days, you really should have it to them in 15 days. Okay, what does the letter say? Again, educate yourself on the 21 CFR Part 820 regulations. The warning letter will cite the specific violations, just like the example I showed you where that dental company received the information that it did from the FDA. It cited several violations that the letter had out there for the owner of the warning letter. If you cannot afford the time or resources, hire a consultant. The FDA really accepts no excuses. If they were to issue you a warning letter, and if you were to get with them at some point in time, determined yet to be in the future, and they come back to you and say, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you give us a response to these findings? And even if you say, well, excuse me, Mr. or Mrs. FDA, you can see that we are 4 people here, and I don't have the time or the resources to address this letter. After all we're manufacturing is X, so something to you that doesn't seem very important. FDA will not allow that type of a response. All FDA wants, maybe that's the wrong way to say it all, but what they expect is compliance. I've had that said to me before when I was sitting across the table from them quite a few years ago. They said, we want to see compliance. And what you have to do on your end from the company's perspective to get you in compliance, that is what one needs to do. And lastly, I can provide references to a consultant if you like. I'm not in, I don't get a kickback if I recommend someone. I have a couple that I talk with. I bounce things off them. Sometimes they will bounce things off me. But if you find yourself in the predicament where you need to have a consultant address a warning letter, I would be more than happy to, in confidentiality, supply you with that information. Okay, next, what the letter doesn't say. Okay, now we have to go on some assumptions. Assuming that this is your first warning letter you may have received, and you do not manufacture Class 3 devices. Again, for those who may not know, a Class 3 device is the highest risk of devices, and it's usually life-sustaining, or again has a very high risk factor to the end user, is a Class 3 device. The letter doesn't say you are the worst manufacturing company in the United States of America and you should be ashamed of yourself. That is not what the letter says. Again, understand that when the letter says that your products are, I'm sorry, I just drew a blank, that they are adulterated. When the letter says your devices are adulterated, that's what every warning letter says. And I don't know if I've mentioned it yet to this point, but just so you know, a warning letter in my, as it say, excuse me, that's my next bullet point. It doesn't say you can no longer sell your products. Okay, you can continue to sell what you're selling as long as you operate within the auspices and the guidelines of the QSR, and that if you have violations that the FDA determines you aren't, as long as you promise to get them within compliance, and you do, then you can continue to sell your products. But the letter does not say it's a secret and no one else will see it. That's what I wanted to say in just a moment ago. Don't think that this will be just a private conversation. It's a private correspondence between you and FDA. Once the FDA issues a warning letter, it goes to the agency's website and it is posted. If anyone, if you would like to know where that information can be found, I would be happy to let you know. But that isn't necessarily within the course of this discussion. But just be aware that it is not something just between you and the agency. Anyone, any company, any manufacturer, any individual with a computer can access it if they know where to look. Well, now that we know what a warning letter is, how a person gets a warning letter, we know what a warning letter isn't. Let's talk about remediation. How do we correct this warning letter? Well, first of all, understand that if you receive the letter, the agency will expect you to have a corrective and preventive action procedure, or as the FDA lingo likes to call it, a CAPA. Now you can call it CAP1, you can call it CAPA-001. What you call it is your business, but it is your responsibility to have a procedure for corrective and preventive actions. And if you don't have a CAPA procedure, the agency will issue you a violation because you don't have one. It's best to open a corrective action for every violation noted on the letter. There are a few instances where you can group some of them together, but in issuing a corrective action for each and every one, it lets the agency know that, hey, I'm taking this serious. It means something to me and my company that we want to be in compliance with the QSR. So that's why it's best to open a corrective action for every violation on the letter. And ensure you address it in its entirety. In that warning letter we looked at before from that dental company, I did not dissect that letter to see if everything it mentioned could be addressed in one corrective action. But what you don't want to do is just, for every infraction, you don't want to throw them into the pot and tell FDA, well, we threw them into our CAPA pot, and we're going to have one big CAPA, we're going to have one big corrective action to address all these things. The FDA will not accept that. They need to know exactly what you are correcting when you say you're going to correct something, so that they can ensure that you are in compliance with the regulation. And lastly, with a corrective action, there's always a root cause, something at the very core that caused this, whatever the violation is, something that caused that to happen. So you need to be able to determine that and communicate that effectively to the FDA so that they know you have an effective CAPA program. Let's talk again some more about remediation. Ensure that you address those responsible for correcting the violation. Notice I did not say ensure you address those responsible for the problem. The FDA, from a regulatory standpoint, they don't care what the source of the problem is. They only care that they have identified a problem, and it's up to you, the company, to put a fix in place to correct it. Rather than saying in a corrective action response, someone will take care of ABC. It's best to say, and it's best to also not use personal names. People come and go. Sometimes in the regulatory world, the one responsible for the regulatory program, that person is no longer on the roster when a warning letter occurs. And while that's, it's not funny to anyone's employment, it does happen. But make sure you let the FDA know that you have assigned the responsibility for this to an entity at your facility that will ensure that it's being taken care of. Ensure specific dates are set and they are realistic. If you have a corrective action that's going to take you 2 months to correct, the FDA is okay with 2 months, but make sure you say 2 months. Don't say I'm going to get it corrected in 10 days, because there is always that option that FDA may come back in 2 months when you say you were going to have it fixed, or 10 days. And if your timetable is longer than what you told them, be prepared to have an extensive sit down with them of why that occurred. Know that most violations will need to be corrected with a new or updated procedure. Because if you understand the quality system regulation, that is what FDA inspects and audits too, is the QSR. So if they point out something to you that is incorrect, it will need to have a revised procedure, a new procedure, something that to them shows that you understood what the problem was, you understood what the violation was, and you have something new or updated to take care of that situation. And here's one of the most important things: send copies of any procedure you mention. So if you have a corrective action and you say, we have corrected this situation with our new QP 101 for a sterilizing product, the FDA will acknowledge that. And I have seen many warning letter responses where it says, you have indicated that you have a new procedure in place. However, you did not send the copy of that procedure. So an additional follow-up inspection will be required to ensure that you are still following the regulation. Please understand, that doesn't mean if you send them copies of any procedure that they won't come in, but any meaningful information that you can send to them that shows that you are complying with the regulation, that will be better on your behalf for any future inspections. Remediation number 3. When I talked a moment ago about a root cause, be cautious with root cause of insufficient training. I have used this as a root cause when issuing a corrective action, and many people use this for a root cause for a corrective action. But be cautious with it, because it is common, and the FDA is it's routine for them to see this as a common root cause. Keep in mind, when FDA wants to know, they want to know that you know what caused the problem before you can fix it. Because if you intend to put a corrective action in place without addressing the root cause, they're going to assume that it can occur again because you have not done that. Many people think that their employees weren't properly trained. They weren't properly informed. They didn't have, maybe there was a class we should have sent them to. So that's why they say, or put down as the root cause, is insufficient training. Again, just be cautious, because FDA will allow 1 or sometimes 2 is insufficient training to be documented as the root cause. But if you become in a habit of doing that, or you list it multiple times, then they will say that training is one of the problems with your quality system, because every time there's a corrective action, you say that there's insufficient training. someone should have had a class that they didn't go to, something of that effect. And so that will be either when they leave the building or possibly in a future response to you. The FDA will say that another violation you are dealing with is insufficient training or an insufficient training program. Remediation number 4. And just like the procedures, if there's any documentation you generate as a correction to the findings, send copies. Okay. If you do some retraining, you need to send that training form with the individual signatures, with their names, printed on one side and in cursive on the other, and the date that the training occurred and what the training was for. If you say that there has been some new training, again, it's just like the procedure. They don't know that unless you send the documentation. The argument always exists with some of those who like to be the devil's advocate that, well, just because I sent the information doesn't mean that I really did it. And they're correct. And if one wanted to have that viewpoint, they would be correct. The danger is when FDA comes back, and they will come back at some point in time in the future, that they will see whether you really did it or whether you didn't. The FDA is good at what they do. And in addition to the training records and the procedures, if you have any type of form to record information that you think is very meaningful and helpful to address the corrective action, then send the new or amended forms. Again, any information you can send to them, the better. Meaningful information. If you have a new procedure, protocols, validations, or letters of rationales, sometimes there are parts of the QSR that you are exempt from, that you do not have to comply with. And when the FDA came in, they may have taken, again, they don't stay, all year to inspect your program. They're usually there from 3 to 7 days, unless you have a big facility or the violations they encounter are pretty severe, then they can stay longer. But if a particular portion of the regulation doesn't apply to you, you can have a rationale written that says this doesn't apply to us and why. But again, you can't just say, I know it doesn't, and expect the FDA to be okay with that. You have to send them the information and the documentation that proves that. Again, FDA is always looking for proof. And the FDA they don't want to see it's not that important. If there is a portion of the regulation that doesn't apply to you, don't say it's not that important. Put information in there that explains perhaps what a requirement is and why your particular operation or your device doesn't need to comply with it. Again, the FDA does not like to see that, which they have seen in the past. And now you may ask, well, that's a lot we just talked about. How can I do all that in 15 days? Well, one doesn't have to have all the corrections done in 15 days. This is something that is important as a manufacturer in responding to a warning letter that you need to know. For each action, when we talked earlier about give a timeline, how long it will take to complete, that's okay. If you say it's going to take, I can get it done in 5 days, then you should get it done in 5 days. If you say it's going to take 12 months, say it's going to take 12 months. Again, that depends on the seriousness of the violation. That depends on the risk to the end user and to the patient, but give a timeline that is reasonable. And FDA will expect major corrections to take time. In the facility that I was at years ago, we had what was called a form, fill, and seal machine. It was an aging piece of equipment. And so when the FDA had inspected that some of our the packaging wasn't what they thought it should be, we addressed that by saying we're going to buy a new machine. And it took 18 months from the time of that visit till we could secure purchase orders, till we could validate the machine, we could execute the proper protocols, and we had the machine installed and my company. So again, they are okay with a timeline. You just have to make sure that it's realistic. And I'd just like to say we're getting close to wrapping up. There is no FDA one size fits all. And just to let you know that these guidances and notes are from my experience with the FDA. I have attended numerous FDA conferences, and I've got the chance to interact with some other colleagues there. And with the conversations that we have had, my experiences are not unique, which means that the FDA pretty much inspects and audits all the same, because all investigators are trained the same, but all audit differently and ask different questions with different specialities. You may get an investigator today that is very amicable, very pleasant to work with. In the next year or at a different time, you may get their coworker, and they may make your life very miserable for the time that they are there. So just understand that all investigators are trained the same, but all audit differently. Okay, well, you've answered the letter. You've put all of your corrective actions together. You've got all your responses, the things that you want to send, and you've sent them to the FDA. And now you're waiting for a response. Well, what you have to understand is FDA operates on their timetable. Okay. If your violations pose no serious threat to safety, they are in no rush. Sometimes they have airborne food illnesses. Anytime anytime a department that the FDA interacts with, if there is a national emergency or health scare, they will put your issues off if you have no violations and you pose no serious threat. Here's a big hint. If you haven't heard from the agency in a few weeks, don't call them. Don't email them. Don't say, hey, we got this warning letter and we sent a response in and we're waiting to hear from you. That's not wise. Anytime you interact with the agency, don't communicate with them unless they ask you to, or unless it's a mandatory thing that you need to do. And finally, when you do receive the final results, ensure you are aware of what the closeout letter says. Ensure that the letter, like the example that I just showed previously, if it says that your response is inadequate, that means you have to reply again. That doesn't mean that you just, well, you said it's inadequate, and in your mind you're thinking, well, we'll just have it fixed when they come for the next time. That isn't what FDA means. They mean you need to send something else that is satisfactory to them, again, to show that you are in compliance with the regulation. And that's the end of my presentation. I hope that has been helpful. I hope it doesn't leave you too scared. If there's anything, as long as, hey, it's a 5-minute conversation, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation or email dialogue with you to talk about some other issues with FDA. But with that, I hope this helps those that listen today. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that information and the wealth of knowledge that comes behind it. We do have a couple of questions for you I thought it'd be appropriate to ask. And the first one is about the seminar. Is this only for those with a Class 2 medical FDA 510K permit?
Well, that is a very good question. I would have to look at the devices that a person is manufacturing. Some Class 1 devices are exempt from the regulation. Some are not. Most are exempt, but some are not. And whatever device that you were manufacturing, I would have to look at the device class, what's the product regulation number, and to see whether it is exempt or not. Or, if you could tell me whoever this person is, email me. I can send you the information where you can find it, but it would be easy for me to look it up. So I'm sorry that I can't answer that question, other than to say that most Class 1 devices are exempt, however, some are not.
Okay, excellent. Now, the second question is, I thought the FDA would only visit my lab if I was a Class 2 or 3 type laboratory.
That is incorrect. Keep in mind, the FDA can visit anyone, anytime, any medical device manufacturer that they want. Now, you are correct in part that if you are manufacturing devices that are exempt from the regulation, most of the time you will never see them. But even if you are manufacturing a device that is exempt, and you are manufacturing a device that, for heaven forbid, somehow, some way has the ability to cause someone harm or a serious injury or death, and that happens at least once, and if it happens more often, you can guarantee a visit from the FDA. Again, FDA, sometimes they like to leverage their power, and they show others that they can wield their power whenever they want, wherever they want. But again, it only applies to medical device manufacturing. But if you unfortunately fall under one of those categories, even if you are just a class 1, then you could expect a visit.
Okay, great. Well, those are our 2 questions that we had today. Remind everybody that if you do have any other questions, that you can certainly email us at the Technical Support Department at the Whitmix Corporation, or give us a phone call. Either way, we will find an answer for you. And just a reminder that this webinar was recorded, so you can watch it again if you so desire. Expect, for those of you who signed up for it, expect that there will be a letter or an email for you, regarding your CE credits within a short period of time. I think that's it. And John, appreciate you, and everybody else, thanks. Come join us again.